Welcome to another week of Intro to American History since 1877. We will pick up where we left off on Friday for today's lecture and class discussion and talk a little bit more about the West. Last week we discussed westward expansion and manifest destiny and the political movement and that led to America becoming a transcontinental nation spanning coast to coast. And then on Friday, we discussed in great deal some of the conflicts that emerged as as a result of the growth in the West, particularly with white settlers moving out west, spurred on by the Homestead Act and other opportunities, and clashing with Native Americans who were already living and subsisting out west, which resulted in a lot of conflict and the Indian Wars in various territories and states out west. And we discussed how that all came to a close with the Wounded Knee Massacre and the end of armed Native American resistance or organized Native American resistance, I should say, against the U.S. For the 19th century. So today we will take a look at a different direction in our study of the West, and that is the newcomers that come out west, particularly from other parts of the country, so not looking at the Native Americans per se, but migrants from the East Coast, as well as Mexican immigrants and Chinese immigrants. We talked a little bit about the exodusters last week, and so you're aware that African Americans migrated to the West during the second half of the 19th century. But we'll talk a little bit more as in today's discussion about the newcomers out west and the economic development that occurred in the West, and particularly the battle between, or the struggle, I should say, between individual entrepreneurs in ranching, farming, and mining versus corporations. And that's a big theme of, in particular, the last 2 decades, 25 years or so, of the West as the frontier becomes settled. And this will be our final discussion on the West. As the week progresses, we will discuss industrial America in the East and in the South, as chapter 16 of your text, The American Yop, discusses, and we will look at that in depth as the week progresses. But for now, let's once again take a look at the West, the American frontier. So one of the things to keep in mind with the West is that in the years after the Civil War, the first few decades after the Civil War, there was a tremendous amount of railroad construction across the country, but especially out west. And that will really transform the entire region. It'll allow more people to travel to the West, migrate to the West, and settle from the East, from the South, from elsewhere. And it will also really enable a new business innovation with the ability to ship goods and products from east to west and west to east, which previously in the antebellum period, the first half of the 19th century, I should say, was not really an option. So let's take a look at the railroads that came out west. One of the main industries that began to flourish in the West in the latter half of the 19th century was railroads, and in particular the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. It was constructed by two railroad companies, Union Pacific and Central Pacific. It connects the eastern United States with the western states and territories. It was the first of what would be several transcontinental railroads completed by the end of the century. And railroads really become agents of economic change. The expansion of this new form of transportation really allows the West to flourish in terms of economic growth and economic development. And it's not just the expansion of railroads, it's also technological advancements, particularly refrigeration. With refrigeration, you could have refrigerated rail cars that could ship products such as meat that had been processed from meat packing plants in Chicago. So ranching became very big business in the West at this time, and the ranchers would get their cattle and livestock onto trains that would ultimately wind up in Chicago. Slaughterhouses would be there in Chicago to slaughter the cattle, and meat packing plants would process the meat. But then once the meat was processed, they had to have a way to ship it back east and have it be fresh and appealing to butchers and restaurants and things of that nature. So refrigeration, the refrigerated rail cars enabled products such as meat to be transported from west to east in a more efficient manner. And that results in tremendous economic growth and expansion in the western United States. Railroads, in short, make the West smaller. They'll enable people, goods, products to move from place to place in a much quicker, more efficient manner and fashion. As a result of these transportation and technological advances, the West experiences a major population boom in the second half of the 19th century. In Kansas alone, for example, population surges from 107,000 in 1860 to 365,000 just 10 years later, and nearly 1 million residents in Kansas by 1880. That's a tremendous amount of growth in a relatively short period of time. If you take a look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see men working on railroad construction, a scene that was common throughout the what we now call the Midwest, but back in that era, states like Illinois and Missouri and Kansas were the West, Great Plains states. But this was a scene that was common throughout the Great Plains states and the West during this time. So railroads become a major agent of economic change as well as population change in the West during this era. And with this economic change brings corporate investment and corporate development, and that really changes the way that business gets done in the West. So if you take a look at this slide, I call it the corporate turn. But let's take a look at how corporate investments transform three particular industries. We'll start with ranching. I mentioned earlier that cattle and livestock are valuable commodities as a result of all of these new thousands of miles of railroad tracks. And that created opportunity for ranchers and particularly for cowboys because early on the railroads were not all the way through the West. The railroads ended in Chicago or St. Louis or maybe parts of Kansas. There wasn't railroads in Texas or the Southwest or places of that ilk at the time. And so you had cowboys that would lead cattle drives, particularly from the state of Texas and surrounding areas, and drive cattle to a city with a railroad station, a railroad terminus, if you will, and load up the cattle and livestock onto the trains, and they would then be sent to Chicago by rail, transported to Chicago by rail, where, as I mentioned before, they would arrive and be transferred to a slaughterhouse, killed, processed, and shipped as packaged meat to the East Coast. And this was big business. Individual ranchers and cowboys could make a healthy living doing cattle drives and transporting this cattle and livestock from the early post-Civil War years all the way through the early 1880s. Cattle drives were big business. But eventually, the railroads expanded. And when the railroads expanded, that brought both rail lines and depots into Texas and points further west. And that led to more corporate investment in ranching. Corporations realized they could sort of cut out the middleman, so to speak, and acquire ranches themselves and transport the cattle from their ranches in the West to Chicago themselves without the middleman, or they could just go directly to the ranch and transport, I should say, the cattle to Chicago themselves. But there was a significant decline in cattle drives and in cowboys in the final 15, 20 years or so, really early 1880s through the end of the 19th century in that field. So that's one way in which railroads changed the face of economics out west, and one way in which corporations really begin to usurp the industry from individuals. Another industry we could look at and find a similar trend is farming. I mentioned last week the Homestead Act, passed in 1862, enticed many Americans to leave the East for the West and take up farming. They wanted to become landowners. This was a pathway to doing that and becoming landowners. However, many of these new Western residents struggled to adjust to the rigors of farming. There were many, many obstacles that they encountered, from weather events such as droughts, tornadoes, blizzards, prairie fires, and any number of other mini or major weather catastrophes, to the presence of pests such as locusts and grasshoppers that made farming life very difficult. It was a very hard life. You had to put in a lot of physical labor, I should say, just to make ends meet and turn a small profit. In addition, there was little diversity in terms of crops that you could raise out west. Mostly it was wheat and corn. And as a result of a lack of diversity of crops at this time, the price of these crops drop due to the fact that there's a surplus of both of those products. And many farmers had to go into debt just to turn a profit. And being a farmer over the long haul, as an individual farmer, or even a farmer with your family out there, and having children or siblings or other relatives helping you out, it was very, very difficult to turn anything other than a slight profit. However, if you sold the farmland to corporations, that became an option for individual farmers to profit off of the land that they acquired through the Homestead Act. So, like I said last week, if the individual claimed federal land, 160 acres of federal land via the Homestead Act, and resided on the land and worked to improve it for 5 years, he would get the deed to the land. And if you could make a go of it for 5 years or perhaps a little longer, then eventually the land became valuable to corporate interests, and you could sell the property to corporations for a profit and perhaps move into the growing cities and urban regions as they were popping up across the West during this time. And then one more industry to take into account during this period, this second half of the 19th century, is the mining industry. Mining became very popular right around 1850. Gold is discovered in California in 1849, and that led to a gold rush at that time, and then also other precious metals and minerals such as silver and copper became popular for individual prospectors to search for and to try to extract from the land out west. But as the railroads expand and transportation is easier, it becomes increasingly difficult for individual prospectors to really profit off of their findings, especially after the passage of the General Mining Act of 1872. That was an act that enabled miners the ability to extract minerals on federal land without regulation. And it really was designed by the federal government to encourage development in the West, and development economically through mining, but also to get more people to move out to the West during this time period. But with very little regulation, it became something of a free-for-all, and so corporate interests came out and competed for competed for the precious metals and the minerals against the individual prospectors, and over time it was a losing battle for the prospectors going up against these larger corporations with more resources and more manpower. So that's yet another industry along with ranching and farming, where in the early part of the Western expansion from the 1850s to perhaps 1875 or so, it was possible for individuals to find success economically through ranching, mining, or farming. But as the 1870s drew to a close and the 1880s arrived, it became harder and harder for individuals or small families in any of these businesses to go up against large corporations. And that is somewhat still the case today. There's a lot of developed land out in the West in modern America, contemporary America, but ranching still exists, and cattle and livestock are still obviously a significant part of the economy out west. But these days, many ranches are owned and operated by large corporations. The days of the small independent rancher are not completely gone, but those types of folks are very few and far between today, and that trend started even in the later years of the 19th century. I mentioned the newcomers that were coming out to the West both last week and earlier in today's lecture. But I wanted to take a closer look at the arrival of these newcomers and just who are these people, where are they coming from, and what sort of challenges are they encountering out West, and how does the West change with their arrival? Who settles the West? A diverse group of immigrants and East Coast migrants settle the West during the latter three decades or so of the 19th century. Many of them were European Americans or European immigrants from countries such as Ireland, Scotland, Germany, Russia, the Scandinavia region, the Czech region, all of these folks initially settled in the East, New York City, and other points in the Northeast, but eventually moved out West to take advantage of the Homestead Act or try to make a go of it in a new region with plenty of opportunity. In addition to these European Americans, there were immigrants from Mexico, Asia, and of course the African Americans that we talked about in depth last week, the Exodusters and Pap Singleton. They arrived in the West during this area as well. And there was tremendous population growth in the span of 30 years, 3 decades, from 1870 through 1900. 2 million Americans moved west from the eastern United States. So this is a tremendous influx of people, and they changed the landscape of the West. It's not all white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It's clearly not all Native Americans, but sort of a mixed bag of immigrants from all over Europe, as well as from Asia and Mexico, and African Americans mostly coming from the South during this time. So each of these groups sort of puts their own stamp on the western region of the United States during this time period. However, there is one group that is sort of singled out by the white settlers out there, and that is the Chinese immigrants. Immigrants from China began to arrive in the West after the initial gold rush in California in 1849, 1850, and as a result, the mining industry really begins to take off. The first wave of Chinese immigrants comes over. It's primarily single men. They would later send for their families in the second wave of immigration, and they would take jobs in mining, railroad construction, and other forms of hard labor. But as the railroads expanded and more white immigrants or white migrants, I should say, were moving out toward the West, they were alarmed at the presence of Chinese immigrants, and as a result, anti-Chinese sentiment grew in the West. Now, if you followed the 2020 election, one of the major themes of the election, one of the major topics that the candidates sparred with each other about was immigration and immigration reform. It was an issue in the 2016 campaign as well. And if you remember, about 15 years ago, some of you may recall, immigration reform was an issue that George W. Bush and his administration tried to work on as well. But those are the contemporary examples of immigration being a controversial topic that dominates part of the political conversation in America. But that's not new. It's not something that is just cropped up in the 21st century. As we see, when we study the West in the late 19th century, this goes all the way back to the late 1870s and the 1880s with the anti-Chinese sentiment that developed out west. It'll also come up as an issue after World War I in the early 1920s, which we will discuss in detail later this semester. But there are historical roots for immigration and trying to regulate immigration and trying to determine who can come to America, when and why, and who qualifies, who gets citizenship. That's something that's really part of the American story, a nation founded upon immigrants. And really in this late 19th century, with the immigrants from China coming to California and other points in the West, it becomes a very, very controversial topic. Why is that? Because the presence of these Chinese immigrants creates competitions for jobs. As I mentioned, they're mostly doing hard labor jobs, such as railroad construction and mining, but those are jobs that would either go to Chinese immigrants or Mexican immigrants or the African Americans out in the West at this time, or they would go to white laborers, the white working class of that time period, if you will. And they were not happy with this competition, this group of Chinese immigrants creating just one more hurdle for some men to get jobs that, although they were difficult jobs, you were able to make a living with those jobs. So competition for jobs, as well as the Chinese culture versus the American culture and the many differences between those two, that made a lot of white people, particularly people in the white working class during this time period, very uncomfortable. And it became something of a grassroots political movement at that time to try to curtail Chinese immigration into America. Chinese immigrants, for lack of a better term, they are othered by Americans in the West at this time period. Now, what does that mean exactly? When I say othered, that's when Americans, particularly white Americans, pick out a particular ethnic or racial group and argue that that group does not deserve the same rights, the same citizenship, the same overall status as the white Americans. Because you are not like me, you are something other. I can tell that you are other by the color of your skin or your ethnicity, national origin, things of that nature. And this was taking place in the West with the Chinese immigrants at this time. It's also something that, on a smaller scale, happens in the East in the late 19th century and early 20th century, because the white immigrants that were coming, particularly from Eastern Europe, and even some places in Western Europe that were outside of England and Ireland and other Anglo-Saxon countries, they were considered non-whites by many of the Eastern U.S. Citizens at that time. So the concept of being an other has a long and insidious history in American life, and we can see it in various forms in the 19th century, in the 20th century, and even today. But I think that it's interesting that some of the same reasons that the Chinese immigrants were scapegoated and othered by the white working class in the West during this era. Also, those sort of same sentiments crop up today when you hear folks talk about the need for border walls and other forms of restricting legal immigration to America. It'll take jobs away from native-born Americans and things of that nature. So a lot of these issues resurface over the course of American history with some slight differences here and there, and sometimes we resolve those differences, and other times things remain up in the air and controversial to a degree. I mentioned that the immigration reform, particularly with regard to Chinese immigrants in the West during this time, becomes a major political issue in the 1880s. There was so much anti-Chinese sentiment that it led to a grassroots political platform with the goal, I should say, of curtailing Chinese immigration, and it works to a degree. In 1882, Congress passes the Chinese Exclusion Act. This legislation immediately halts all immigration from China for 10 years, except for students, teachers, diplomats, merchants, and travelers. So as you can see with the groups that were able to circumnavigate this Chinese Exclusion Act and come to the U.S. during this time period, this 10-year period when the ban had taken place, these are all sort of white-collar folks and educated folks. The Chinese Exclusion Act was designed to exclude working-class Chinese immigrants from coming to the U.S. and taking working-class jobs, physical, manual labor type jobs, away from the white Americans that were competing for those same jobs. In addition to banning immigration from China for 10 years, it also prevented the immigrants that were currently in the U.S. at that time from applying for U.S. citizenship, and if they chose to leave and go back to China, they couldn't come back legally. So if their family was still over in China, they were stuck here unless they were willing to go over there and try to illegally immigrate to America. And frankly, plenty of folks did make attempts at doing that, of getting around the bill through illegal immigration back in the 1880s and into the 1890s. Another major effect of the Chinese Exclusion Act is that it established and affirmed white supremacy in the West. So we talked about white supremacy in the South during the end of Reconstruction. We'll get to that a little bit more later this week and next week. That will be a theme at various points during our study of the 20th century as the semester progresses, but this is white supremacy in the West, and it's white supremacy over Chinese immigrants. If you take a look in the left-hand corner of the upper left-hand corner of the screen, this is a newspaper headline right after the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed in 1882, and you can see the large type, bold type lettering. It says, "Hip, hurrah, Chinese excluded, Democratic Chinese exclusion bill from your Democratic president. Chester A. Arthur, incidentally, was the president of the United States who signed the Chinese Exclusion Act into law in 1882 after it was passed by Congress. So, as we get to the 1890s, and we take a look at the West and the frontier, one thing that we really have to take into consideration, I think, in examining this period is what did some of the leading contemporary scholars of the time, how did they view the West and the frontier as the 19th century drew to a close? And perhaps the most prominent American historian in the country at the time, Frederick Jackson Turner, wrote a paper called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, and he presented it at the annual conference of the American Historical Association in 1893. You can see Turner in the upper right-hand corner of your screen here. That's a picture of Frederick Jackson Turner. Turner's frontier thesis within his paper contended that the frontier, the Western frontier, but the frontier in general, shaped the habits and mindset of Americans. And what he meant by that was that he believed that from the moment English settlers arrived on American soil in the 17th century, Americans had to adapt to the challenges of settling and developing in a previously undeveloped land, the frontier, if you will, and that as the country had grown and expanded, the frontier was explored further westward. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion on the West last week, the concept of manifest destiny and of going all the way to the edge of the continent, the Pacific coast, that was sort of the mindset of the time period to claim all of that land for America and settle it and develop it. In Turner's view, the challenges of settling and developing the frontier forced Americans to adapt, acquire what he called a masterful grasp of material things, and embrace a spirit of what he referred to as dominant individualism and democracy, and that all of this was done in democracy. All this progress, this development, was done with democracy in terms of government and democracy in terms of spirit at the heart of it. And part of the reason that he wrote this paper and made these arguments at this time was that in the wake of the 1890 census, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that the frontier had closed because of the overwhelming population growth of the West. The Census Bureau stated that there were just not that many areas out west where that were sparsely populated. That essentially that the West had been populated and settled, and as a result, there was no clear line on a map that separated the developed nation from the frontier. And Turner, in his thesis, lamented this fact that the frontier was closed. He believed it would prevent Americans from acquiring the skills and personality traits that they were forced to develop through Western settlement, particularly individualism and adapting to a new environment in harsh surroundings. Turner's thesis influenced many future historians in the decades that followed. For a good chunk of the 20th century, this was considered a groundbreaking argument and a groundbreaking assertion from Turner in terms of putting the frontier and the western United States into greater focus. But there were plenty of flaws with his thesis, exaggerations, omissions, and other areas where it just fell short to really truly capture how the frontier was settled and developed. In particular, he neglected to discuss the role of women in the West, as well as the role of non-white men, Mexican immigrants, Chinese immigrants, the African-American exodusters that helped develop the West during this time period. Turner's thesis pretty much gives the credit, for lack of a better term, to Western development, for Western development, I should say, to white men, and really completely ignores the role that many other non-white males played in settling the West, developing the West, expanding the West as a commerce center. In addition, Turner also failed to mention the impact of technological advancements in the development of the West, such as the refrigeration that I mentioned earlier in our discussion today, that enabled ranchers to ship meat from their livestock to the east after it had been slaughtered and processed in the meat packing plants. If you don't have refrigerated rail cars, there's no way to effectively and efficiently transport the fresh meat to the eastern U.S. and the markets that were available in the East at this time. In addition, Turner also failed to mention the government subsidies that helped develop the West, the role of the federal government in enticing both individuals and corporations to go out and develop the West. The Homestead Act is an example of this. The General Mining Act of 1872 that I mentioned earlier in the lecture today is an example of this. Without direct federal government subsidy and involvement, the West would not have been built as completely and as quickly, economically and culturally as it did. It would have unfolded much differently, and there's simply no way that it would have happened in the same time frame had it just been the rugged individualism of Americans on their own, particularly the white American males that Turner championed in this thesis. So there's some parts of the Turner thesis that are remarkably perceptive for its time, but there are many other parts that are lacking and just overall exaggerated and flawed. But it is a significant document in American history during this era, and it would, as I mentioned earlier, stand for several decades to follow, and even historians today still study this thesis as a point of reference. Most of them recognize the flaws with the thesis, but Frederick Jackson Turner is still a very prominent historian and well-regarded historian, an early pioneer in the profession, and he had a lot to say and to argue about the West. And with that, that will close today's lecture, and we will look at industrialization in the eastern United States for the rest of this week on Wednesday and Friday. I will talk to you again on Wednesday. Until then, I hope you have a great couple of days as the week rolls on.